I've had a lot of questions come in with everybody asking, how do I know if my clubs are built correctly and what's the impact that improperly built clubs are going to have on my swing? So we're going to talk exactly about that. We're going to find out what makes a good build. We're going to figure out how to check your clubs to make sure that they're fit properly and built properly for you. And we're going to show you every step along the way so that you can ask the right questions to make sure you're playing the right equipment. So before we make any changes to our equipment, we need to understand what our equipment is doing and how it's built. And there's certain properties that we want to check. And so I want to introduce you to the club set that we're going to be working on, and we're going to go step by step through measuring and creating a blueprint of this set so that we know what we're working with. So if anything is off, we can make those adjustments. So here's our set right here. This is a set of Mizuno MP 33s. This is 3 through pitching wedge, steel shafts, lambkin grips, but we're going to go through and figure out different specs and blueprint these clubs. So the first thing we want to measure is the length of the club. Now, unless you have specifically a one length set of clubs, every club is going to be a different length, and there's a couple different ways to measure that length depending on the manufacturer of your clubs. The traditional way to measure a club is to use something like this Mitchell length machine. We have a right-handed club. We push this all the way down so it sits flush against that nut. And then we come on down to the end of the grip and we can make a measurement and see how long it is. Now, some manufacturers, they measure it a little bit differently. And rather than measuring from the heel of the club up to the top like we just did a second ago, some manufacturers will measure the center of the face up to the top of the club, which is going to change the length. Now, the standard length might be the same, but if we measure it from the middle of the face, we see that this is 37.5 inches. And if we measure it to the beginning of the face down by the hosel, it's 37 inches. Now, this is important to know because depending on the brand of clubs that you're working with, they may have been built to a standard spec, but if you're looking for a specific length, then you need to make sure that you measure it according to how that manufacturer measures it. So the next step is we're going to go through each of the irons, the 3 all the way down through the pitching wedge, and we're going to measure the length of each one and we're going to write it down. So the next thing we're going to do is check the lie and the loft of the club, and I'm going to do that using this called a Mitchell machine. And there's a few different devices out there, but this is a great one. And we have right now the 7 iron clamped down, and we can measure that the current lie angle for a right-handed player, 61 degrees. So we can look at this notch right here. It's debatably 61.5. Okay, and then we come down to the loft. We see that this one is currently at 33 and maybe a quarter, 33.5. Now, the club is what it is, but if we wanted to, we could check it against the manufacturer's standard. And if we do, we see that the lie angle at 61 is standard, but the loft standard was 36 degrees. This one we said was at 33.5, so this club is bent a little bit strong. Now, depending on the player's preference, we might leave those lofts as it is, or we may reset them to the factory standard. Either way, we need to measure each of the clubs and write it down. So the next thing is we need to now understand the weight of the club. And there's 2 kinds of weight. There's the static weight of the club, which is just overall how much the club weighs. And then there's the swing weight of the club. And a swing weight is essentially how heavy the head feels. And it's very important that the swing weight is correct to match your preferences. So to help us out, we have a digital scale. I have it zeroed out. It's going to tell us pounds and ounces. We could do grams if we wanted to. We're just going to sit this club right across, make sure that it's not touching anything on either side. 15.9 ounces, so it's just under 1 pound. Now that's the static weight. So let's now check the swing weight. Now, swing weight, we're using a swing weight machine, and it's important that we calibrate this just like we zeroed out this scale. So we bring this weight all the way down to 0, and now we're going to move this wheel until this is balanced. So we're gonna strengthen right there, nice and slow and steady. And as we do that, we see that it begins to center itself out. And we're trying to find the place where if I just leave it alone, it's gonna come to rest in the middle. So that looks almost a little bit more. So that looks pretty good right there. It's starting to find the center. So we're gonna now put our club into that little notch, flush up against the backside right here. We're gonna balance it into that little part of the cradle. Head is hanging out. And now we move this weight over until again, this starts to balance out. Now, typically, irons are all going to match each other. If we have a certain swing weight in, say, the 7-iron, we usually want it to be the same swing weight in the 3-iron. So here's just about that balance point. And what we're seeing is at the D would be what we call D0, then D1, D2, D3, in this case D3 and a half is where we're finding that balance point. So I'm going to write down the static weight of 15.9 ounces, and I'm going to write down the swing weight of D3.5. Now the last piece here, now that we've measured the length, the loft, the lie, the static weight, the swing weight, is we also want to make note of the flex of the shaft and the size of the grip. Now we also want to make note of that because different shafts have different weights, and although we've gotten the overall static weight, if we are going to make some kind of a change, let's say we're going from 120 gram shafts to 90 gram shafts, that's going to affect the swing weight. So we just need to make note that, hey, for example, these Mizunos we're working on, they have Dynamic Gold S300 shafts in them. And so we know what that club is going to weigh. We also know that they have Lambkin, Crossline, Standard Plus grips. So those also have a weight. So if during the rebuild, if we do a reshafting or a changing of the length, if those components change, the static weight and the swing weight's going to change, and we're going to need to rebalance those back out. So by changing the grip or using lead tape or things like that, we can get the final measurement. But we do need to write down what they have in them currently so that in case something happens down the road, we can get them back to what we want. All right, so now that we've checked everything about the clubs that we're working on, it's time to make some changes. And in this case, we're going to be doing a reshafting, a regripping, and a cutting of length. And each of those steps along the way, we're going to share with you so you know what that process looks like. But we're also going to talk about how it affects your swing and the club's build as well, so that you know, hey, if these weren't built properly, it's probably going to affect my swing. But if they were built properly, then it becomes an extension of your body, and that's exactly what we want to happen. So part of this build that we're going to be doing is reshafting the irons. So here are the shafts that are going to go into the clubs. And I've already measured their static length. This is not the length that the club is going to be once assembled. This is just the length of the shaft as it is right now. And that way, I'll know which shaft goes into which club. So we have the longest club is going to go into the 3-iron and so forth, and then we're going to cut it down to size. But the next step is we need to pull the shafts that are currently in the clubs out. All right, so one of the tricky things here is I want to save these original ferrules. What's really neat is each of these ferrules has a unique serial number right on it. Okay, and that's something that I definitely want to keep and put onto these new shafts. So we need to pull the head while saving that ferrule. So to do that, we're going to take this club and we're going to clamp it on down into this machine. We're going to take our blowtorch and we're going to put it on the hosel, but we're going to aim it a little bit away from the ferrule, point it slightly towards the head so that the heat doesn't melt the ferrule, because that ferrule being plastic will melt very easily. So we give this a little bit of time, and then we're going to see if that breaks the seal. It does not yet. So we're going to loosen it up, turn the head so that the flame can now get a different part of it. And then here in a second, once the epoxy on the inside of the club starts to melt from the heat of the torch, we should, no, not quite there, we need a little bit more. Let's get the other side. Okay, there we go. Now the head is loose, just wobbling it back and forth. Keep pulling, there it goes. And now the head is loose. We can take this guy out, clean off some of that old epoxy, and now we need to remove the ferrule. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna take this little device, put it around the shaft up by the ferrule, and now we're going to take a hammer, we're going to hit down lightly, and it pops that ferrule right off. So now we have a saved ferrule with that unique serial number, and then we have another shaft that we can use for a different build on a different day. Next, because the tips are different diameters between the shafts that we pulled out and the shafts that we're putting in, we need to sand these tips down to fit. And we can do that because we have a graphite shaft here that we can taper into the appropriate size. So the next step is we need to get these new shafts on, and that's going to require us to epoxy the heads. But in order to get the swing weight where we're trying to get it, we need to add extra weight to the head. So in this case, we're using a combination. We have a little weight kit here. You can see there's a bunch of different weights. And in this case, we have 6-gram weights that are meant for graphite shafts that we'll be using. And we're also going to be using some lead powder. And so we have our scale out so that we can measure how much lead powder and epoxy we're using so that that weight can be taken into consideration to make sure that the swing weight is correct. So one of the things that we need to do here is first, because of the ferrule that we're using here, we're saving the original ferrules, which have serial numbers on them. So I wanted to make sure that we save these. And we need to get this ferrule seated. And because we're using this weight, which is going to go in there, we need to make sure that the ferrule is on the appropriate amount. So what I have here is a little screwdriver and the head. And so we're going to stick the screwdriver inside the head and then bump my finger up against it. That's as deep as this is going to go in. And when we compare that distance against the length right here, we actually see that the ferrule is not on all the way. So what we need to do is put the head on and give it a very good push. So we're going to use a heat gun to warm up the ferrule just a little bit and then push it on until this ferrule slides down a little bit. And now we're going to recheck. So same deal, we take out our head, we take out our screwdriver, check the depth, and now we measure that depth against what we see here. Now that's a much better fit. So now we're ready to move on to the next step because we know that all of this is going to fit inside of the head properly. So next, we're going to turn on our scale, and we're going to turn it on with the cup already on it so that it's accounted for. You can tear it again if you need to. But we're going to take our lead powder and we're going to weigh it. Now I want 2 grams, but I'm weighing out 3 because not all of it is going to actually make it into this concoction, if you will. So now we're going to take our epoxy. Put a little globule down. Take our mixing stick, begin to mix it. This is when the two pieces of the epoxy, they start to work together to create the bond. And this is where we will sprinkle in our lead powder. And then very slowly, we're going to incorporate this lead powder into the epoxy. Being very careful not to splash it all over the place. Definitely don't want to be breathing in lead powder, and you don't want to make a mess anywhere. So after about 30 seconds to a minute, depends on your epoxy, this is going to be mixed. And we're going to take the epoxy. We're going to wipe it up, and we're just going to shove it on into the head and glob it around. And then we're going to take a little bit more. And now this is going to go on the shaft. Make sure the weight is there. Definitely don't want to forget that weight. Take more epoxy. Coat it as best we can. Okay, and now we're going to take the head, we're going to put it on, and then we're going to rotate, we're going to twist as we push, getting all the air out. I can actually hear air coming out the end of the shaft. We're just going to keep twisting, keep pushing, and then eventually it's going to be on. Now, the big thing here is if there's not enough room for the air, then you're going to push this thing on and it's going to push against you and the head will come off. Even if your epoxy is strong, the force of air is going to push it, which is definitely no fun. We're going to wipe off the excess. We're going to tap this on the ground again just to make sure that it's perfectly flush. And then we're going to do the same thing with the next one. So let's bring this over here. We have a little block on the floor. We're just gonna make sure it's on, and then we're gonna make sure it's positioned properly. What I mean by that is most commonly the shaft is gonna go on with the logo on the underside. So if we take a look here, we have the logo of the shaft, and we want this on the underside. So we're just gonna make sure that we set it in the best way so it's directly on the bottom. Now if you have pured shafts which have gone through a puring process to figure out where the most stable part of the club is, then you should put the shaft in according to where it's been pured. But if you're not using pured shafts like we are, then we're just going to go logo down with it, and then we're going to sit this guy against the wall, head down, so that it can cure. And we want to go head down because if we flip it upside down and the head is up top, then the epoxy can actually leak down the shaft, which is not what we want. So we want it to be able to settle down here in the bottom. So that one looks good, and we'll move on to the next. And now we just got to let them cure up. So we have all the heads epoxied onto their new shafts, and once they are all done, then we can trim the shafts to length and we can put on the grips. All right, so we are in the final stages here. We have blueprinted everything. We measured out the length, the lie, the loft, the weight, the swing weight. We took note of the shafts, the weight of the shafts, the size of the grip. All that is done. We've pulled the heads, we've re-shafted them. Everything is good to go. Other than now, we need to put on the grips. So there are a few different ways that we can do grips, but the most common way is to use double-sided tape and solvent, and that's what we're going to do today. So we have our grip. Now, per the customer's request, we're gonna be doing what's called logo down. Now, this doesn't apply to all clubs, but some clubs like this one, we have the Lambkin name, which would normally be the top, but this player wants it down. So we're gonna flip that to the underside. So we're gonna come back to that in just a second. Now, if there's any kind of tape or anything like that on this club, we wanna remove that so we have a clean surface to be working on. I'm gonna set this club into my vice clamp here with the grooves of the club straight up and down, and that's gonna help me put on the grip the right way. So we make sure that is straight up and down. Now we're gonna take this grip, at least this is the way I do it, and I hold the grip next to the shaft and pull myself a piece of tape. And that's going to tell me where to put the tape, because I don't want the tape to be sticking out the end of the grip. So we put it on, drag our finger back so that there's a nice seal. Now I have about an extra inch of tape over the end here. We're gonna fold it underneath, smooth it out, and then take the other side, tape it down, smooth it out. And then in this case, we're just gonna use one piece of tape. If the player wanted it built up, extra 2 wraps, extra 4 wraps, 2 under the right hand, whatever it is, this is the time to do that. With this player, we're just going standard. So we're gonna take this extra material here. I like to pinch it and then twist it. And then it's going to tuck in and live right here at the end of the grip. And that's gonna help so that no, say, water or debris can get through this hole at the end of the grip and find its way into the shaft, accelerating the decay of the shaft, potentially rusting it or having the head fly off or things like that. So now we're going to plug this hole with our finger, and we're gonna take some grip solvent. I'm gonna pour this grip solvent or squeeze this grip solvent into the grip, cover it up with my finger, give it a good couple shakes, and then we're gonna let that solvent drip out on the double-sided tape, and the solvent makes the tip not sticky. It's gonna make it slippery. And now we're gonna put this right on, give it a little push, make sure it's seated all the way down at the end. Sometimes the end of the grip will actually be hanging off and there's extra rubber, and we definitely don't want that. So we push it on all the way. Beautiful. Take this, dry off that solution. Now, depending on the method of how you change grips, it could take 5 minutes. It could take, say, an hour to be usable. With this solvent that we're using, we're looking at probably 20-30 minutes for it to dry up and evaporate enough where the grip will no longer move. And so now that we've done one, we got to do the rest. All right, so now that the grips are on there, they must be ready to play, right? Well, no. See, the thing is, because we changed the length of the clubs, we now need to make sure that the lie angles are correct in the playing position for the player. We also need to make sure that the lofts are tuned back to either factory standard or where the player wants them. In this case, they want them back to factory standard. So while the grips are drying, we're gonna throw them back onto our Mitchell machine right here, and we're gonna pull up the specs and we're gonna get them bent to the proper setting for this player. All right, we finally got the lofts and the lies correct for the player's spec. So technically they are usable right now. But we're gonna go one step farther and we're just gonna get them cleaned up so that they're looking good. We're just gonna take a little bit of water, a little brush, clean them up. If we were gonna do a paint fill, that would be the time to do it, is now. Get that paint fill in there, let the paint dry, and then clean it on up. But we are in the home stretch here. All right, so it finally happened. We are done. We have the full build complete. They are cleaned up and they are ready for play.